You know, son, you're not a kid anymore.
Oh, no, I go to
Shows.
Dad. I already know all this stuff.
Well, they don't teach you about everything.
At shows.
Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants? So just listen. When boys and girls get a little older, they start getting
Interested in punk and hardcore subgenres. Starter Kit.
All right, we're going to have Pops break down First Wave Boston Starter Kit. What's up?
Ready for it. Okay, I want to give a little, lay of the land before we do this. So Boston's an interesting city because it's a transient city due to all the colleges and turnover and the fact that the population goes up so much in the fall when all this new blood comes in. And that makes it a music city, but it's had an odd history because if you think of kind of the wheelhouse of punk rock, Boston was still kind of doing garage bands and pub rock. They weren't really doing the kind of, they don't have these these bands that you would identify with punk that was going around the rest of the United States. So but then you have these other interesting things. Like you have the Modern Lovers, which some people argue is the first punk band. At the same time, after the Modern Lovers, you have the Real Kids, DMZ, Willie Alexander, Nervous Eaters, the Neighborhoods, the Liars, La Peste, and then you have Mission to Burma, who some of them came over from Detroit. But everything's still kind of garage rock with the exception of Burma. So there's kind of no quintessential first wave Boston punk band. You maybe say the Cars, but not really. Still leaning to new wave. And the reason I mentioned Burma, they're kind of interesting because they're influenced by the Stooges and also television, and they were part of this scene happening in Boston in the late 70s and the early 80s. And it was centered around this club called the Underground in Allston, and that's where Joy Division was supposed to play one of their first U.S. shows. Later, New Order played there. Super tiny club, like 100 people. The Cure played there, and there was this interesting art punk scene. So in a weird way, Boston kind of like fast forwards from punk to just post-punk really quickly. And if you are not aware of this label called Propeller Records and you're interested in kind of angular punk, say stuff in the Certain Ratio, Gang of Four zone, and kind of just outsider music, they have a bunch of compilations. The records are really cheap and there's some really cool stuff on there. And a lot of those people went on to do really interesting things. And then just to go back to Burma quickly, as much as they predated hardcore, they also saw Boston hardcore happening. They have, at the last show they have Negative Effects open up. There's a Riot. There's really great audio and video of that. And people who were around then, specifically Al Quinn, had mentioned that he felt like Burma was influenced by hardcore in this weird art rock mashup they were doing. And you can kind of see not that they're writing hardcore songs, but their tempos are speeding up and they're doing all these things that are kind of interesting, getting louder. So I thought that was cool to mention. So then that starts off on my playlist, 1979, Mission to Burma, Peking Spring. It's an up-tempo song. It's super springy, right? It's a very sprightly song. It's anthemic. And then at the end, it goes into this slowed down, more than halftime part that is, we can call it a proto mosh part. We don't have to dissect it, but I think that's a cool starting point for this list. And then, so in tandem, you have these, we'll say propeller bands playing the Underground, and then you have the Gallery East scene, which is where SS Decontrol and the true Boston hardcore scene starts. And what's kind of funny is they're, how much art can you take? They're trying to get away from art, but the only place they can play is this art gallery. And so that becomes the crux of the scene before the channel when hardcore gets bigger. And I'm just going to kind of burn through the bands on this list. You can check out the singular songs, but I want to speak to why they're chosen. So starting it off after Burma with Gangrene, I just think so many bands have talked about, who were around at the time, Misfits specifically, stating that they were, Glenn was so enamored with the speed of Gangrene and the tunefulness that it had an influence on Earth AD, which I think is interesting to bring up. So the two songs on here, Kill a Kami is a little more in that speedy, Beat It Out style, and then Sold Out, which is another track I chose, showed some different dynamics and kind of their sense of humor. And it wasn't about just going as fast as possible, and it was about mixing it up and kind of, I guess, foreshadowing. And I think the thing that gets a little lost on Gangrene is how they were always a very formed band they were like aware of the performance, and they were kind of like, kids of the big rock generation that were ready to light up a room. Next up, have to go with SSD Control. I mean, they had, I think, the definitive sound. It's so brawny. They had the mission statement. What I think is funny, they don't pick songs from the Get It Away EP just because they're on Spotify. On this record, it's very muddy. It's very dense recording. In the fast parts, you can't really tell what the drums are doing, which is kind of awesome. It's just kind of that like hit it before you quit it vibe. But picked Glue, obviously an anthem. But I also really loved, especially as a kid, Force Down. And I think that song's really important, especially in the canon of straight edge, because it did more than just speak to defiance. The lyrics actually articulately break out why this culture sucks. It's I think those songs are important. You can rally behind things, but having this way of conveying like, this is why something isn't cool is super powerful. And those people doing it were the right ones. Threw DOIS in there right after, because it's a brother band. And I think what's kind of interesting of that record is the Brotherhood record. It's all over the place. More Than Fashion, such a great tune, but the record, like a lot of the time, the distortion's coming from the bass rather than the guitars. The guitars can be really tinny. And then you have some songs that are a little sus, like Girls Got Limits and Escape. But Wolfpack is an incredible song as well, even if it's kind of it's kind of a riff on a riff of like the SSD structure, that super caveman rhythmic declaration. But, I think they have to be included. And then we'll go for a hybrid, Last Rites, Negative Effects. I think Chunks, the song, it kind of shows one side of Choke where he could go, where it's a little more Oi influenced, a little more sing-songy, and just kind of like grip it and rip it. And then on the other side, Citizen's Arrest by Negative Effects. It's sort of that classic hit everything, watch the fuck out, mosh part's coming. And even though it's not the beefiest recording, it's a very like threatening song. And get into the FUs. I really think they're an interesting band. DYS and SSD get the collector shine, but Jerry's Kids and FUs are kind of the other side of the coin. Very like great players. Poor Pitiful You. It sounds a little more West Coast, but it's still crunchy. And then I wanted to highlight the song Unite or Lose, because growing up, bands would always cover that song. It was just so catchy. It was almost like you'd hear someone playing it and think they were doing a 7 seconds cover or something. And it's one of those songs that before you know it. And I think it's just a great underrated, another anthemic tune. And go right into Jerry's Kids, just ripper of a band. And everyone I've talked to who saw that band at the time, they'd sing the praises of SSD, but then they'd always say Jerry's Kids, just the full package, like presentation, sound always on point, dynamics always on point, something like super captivating about what they do. And I think everyone should go back and listen to those records, even Kill Kill Kill. It's just great stuff. And then quickly burn through kind of the outliers. You have to talk about the Freeze. They were there, arguably earlier. I think they're a little more traditional hardcore / punk or 1.5, want to give Cape Cod a little shine. And, even I think this song that I picked is really interesting because it's critiquing people who do fanzines and excluding people and being too pro. It makes me want to think, it makes me think like, who are they talking about, right? Like who is excluding them from the scene? And also you can you can hear the dude say hardcore in the song, and that's pretty fucking awesome. And then Proletariat, I guess they're kind of a East Coast analog to Saccharine Trust in a way. It's very UK sounding. It's not, the beefy sound you expect from Boston. There's not a lot of bravado. And I would just say go deep in that catalog, because a lot of the stuff isn't on Spotify, but they're great records, and they kind of get a little more influenced by Gang of Four later on and play a little more angular. And then lastly, putting Siege on there, for me, discovering that band, and then anytime in the 90s I would hear someone name check Siege, I was like, that band's worth peeping. Like, they know something. It's a secret handshake. And, I think what's interesting about them, they weren't from Boston proper. I believe they're from Weymouth, Mass. And, some bands are ignored in their time and spawn genres. And I don't think that's talking too big about Siege. Like, they definitely spawned, people argue they started blast beats. They influenced Napalm Death. There's, so many bands with black and white record covers that drive right back to Siege. I'd almost call them the Velvet Underground of hardcore. Their influence is like that important, and it's kind of nice that it's understated. But yeah, that's my intro to. I wanted to give you the spectrum of the early years.
I think this is an absolutely great starter kit. I love everything on it. The songs you picked are perfect, and yeah, you give some really nice branches too, like to branch out. It's like kind of exactly what we want in a starter kit. Ben, what's your take on this?
Oh man, where do I start? Okay, Mission of Burma. I think of them as like the U.S. Version of Wire. Like they're the U.S. post-punk band of that era. And I saw them in 2002 when they reunited. And there are a few interesting things about that band. One is that their sound guy is an official member of the band. Like they're like, fuck it, we're calling our sound guy like. Am I right about this, Pops? Like their sound guy is a band member. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're doing like, well, they used to do analog tape loops with Martin Swope, but Bob Weston, he was doing sound manipulations during the sets, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and one of them has tinnitus, so he wears those Fred Hammer airport employee headphones to keep his ears intact.
It's a shooting range, like ear protection.
Exactly. And it's funny, I've heard this song a million times. I've heard this song. Ben.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Let's go to the firing range. You've got my number. This song, Peking Spring, I've heard it a million times, but I never noticed that there totally is a mosh part in this song. And it's not just like, oh, it's an indie rock band that has a section of the song that has a slower tempo. Let's call it a mosh part. This mosh part, if you just made the guitars more distorted and Ray Capo sang over it, it would be a Youth of Today song. Like the beat is the same as when Youth of Today plays breakdowns. The chords are what Youth of Today would play. Like it really is that. So that was cool. Gangrene, good band.
Let's jump in on Mission of Burma before we.
Yeah. Okay.
You can take us through the playlist, but Dan, what do you have on Mission of Burma?
I've always viewed Mission of Burma as kind of like the Boston Talking Heads. They were there at the kind of start of this, but they're a bit more arty than the what's regarded as the like spark. Do you know what I mean? And I swear to God, I don't know if he did. He probably did, but like Johnny Marr definitely. When I hear the guitar playing of Mission of Burma, like I always think like, well, here's where REM and the Smiths, listen to this in some of their formation. What I love about Mission of Burma is that they can have the catchiest parts and then the most tangent. And then, I echo everything all three of you have said about this being a proto / consistent mosh part, which is really interesting. And I love that we dived into this song in particular.
Yeah, this song rules so hard. And like the first time I listened to it, I was like, man, it really doesn't need like that last part, you know, like, cause it's kind of out of nowhere. Like it's not like a seamless transition to the mosh part, which is hilarious us calling it the mosh part. But then it just like takes off and like turns into this really special thing. This song is amazing. I'm so glad it's on the playlist. Ben, take us to Gangrene.
Okay. But before we go there, I'm curious when Peking Spring was recorded, because it wasn't released until after the band broke up. I'm looking at Discogs, but Discogs has let me down before, so maybe
it was supposedly recorded in 1979. It came out on that Forget compilation, which is a bunch of odds and ends. But as far as I know, it's one of their earliest recorded songs, and there's footage of them playing it in those expanded reissues at the Underground, which I mentioned, which had to be 80. So super interesting.
Wow. 1979, the only other band I can think of that had mosh parts was Bad Brains' Black Dots demo. So that is really fucking early. The Gangrene, the thing that always confused me about Gangrene is their first album actually comes out in 1986, which is Another Wasted Night. And then you have this preschool collection, which is what the songs that you grabbed are from. But I'm kind of unclear on, and I've owned this CD for a million years, what these songs were originally recorded for and how they actually came out or in the first place. What was the situation?
So most of them were on Boston Not LA, which Boston Not LA is not on Spotify, so that's why I gripped it from there.
I see.
Yeah. But I don't know, because there's so many tunes. I don't know if it was a demo. I'm not sure. I feel like there's a Curtis Tang interview I heard recently where he kind of broke it down. So we can fact check that.
Right. This is Boston Not LA and Unsafe at Any Speed. There's a CD that combines both those comps, and those are basically the entire Boston hardcore scene, not including the straight edge bands from Boston. Like, you have everything on that plus the straight edge bands, and you have pretty much all of Boston hardcore. Would you agree with that?
For sure. And those bands weren't on it in protest, which is really funny, because think of how cool those records would be if SSD and DYS were included.
They'd be totally complete.
I know, that's wild. This Gangrene stuff, I love it so much. It is like as fast as you can get without getting sloppy. Like, the drummer is just amazing. I wonder about that sometimes. We talked about it on the Brad Logan podcast with talking about F-. Like, do you decide to be this fast, or do you just roll with it because you figure out like your drummer can actually do that? You know, like, this is wild style and like very early. This guy's like absolutely amazing. And they do show that they got like the musical chops. Like, they could have done other stuff, but they decided to play hardcore because, like, when they're joking in the beginning of that Sold Out song, like, it is very like musical. Like, they could just write they could be a pop band.
What I love about that song is, they're showing that the Sold Out part is that part, and then it's almost like a reverse sellout, like where they go, give them what they want, and then they go to full blown blasting hardcore. But that first part sounds like it could be Creedence or something, you know?
Yeah.
That's wild.
It's really tuneful. It's really and then they come back into it, and then they go back into give them what they want. You know, it's fucking sick.
And the punk rock sense of humor is still intact. You know, they're making both these songs are really humorous.
Well, even writing the logo out in fake Coke on the you know, because I imagine if that was real Coke, then that would have been a very expensive album cover.
Yeah, and the last thing they ever did in their lives, dude.
Yeah,
that too.
Yeah, going into SSD, this is like, the songs you chose were great because it really does highlight that SSD is just such a wild band, and so much of it is like tribal and rhythmic and not like straightforward textbook hardcore. Like it's just raging wildness, and it would be very hard to describe to someone, right? I think it's like a band that you actually have to listen to. You can't like explain how they sound. Ben, what's your take on this?
I agree with that. Like, I imagine they were influenced by Minor Threat because they're a straight edge band. I mean, there wasn't anything really before them that was claiming straight edge, even though Minor Threat wasn't technically claiming straight edge. Whatever, you get what I'm saying. They were influenced by Minor Threat, no question. And Black Flag, you know, that when Black Flag got a second guitarist, it inspired all these other bands, including SSD, to get a second guitarist. But like, this band does not sound like Minor Threat, and this band does not sound like Black Flag. They are their own thing. And there's nothing, the main thing that sets them apart from those two bands is there's nothing musical about them. Almost nothing musical about them. There's just like, it's just like pure power and like rage and just like a wall of hardcore sound.
Yeah, I almost wonder if like it's one of those things where they're influenced by Black Flag, but then they influence Black Flag, right? Because like the long ring outs that they're doing on the cymbals is like kind of a trope that Black Flag would do so much later and Blast would do and so forth. Like not going like a straight rhythm, like do da 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 da, like almost like the slowdowns. And yeah, it almost just comes back around. Dan,
The other weird thing, real quick, is that they talk about like Discharge being such a huge influence on them, and to be honest, they're almost the opposite of that. Like they have so many more dynamics, but maybe that's the secret sauce, right? that it's because they're you know, Discharge is like kind of like all go no slow for the most part, and this thing is, and they're just all over the place. But I don't know, it's whatever that mashup is, it works, and I love it.
Yeah, I mean, SSD does harness like a pulse in a way, where Discharge is like, it is like a all go like pulse, and SSD is like falling into like a, I don't know, it's like a rhythmic pulse, but there is something like pulsating through the music. Dan, what's your take on this stuff?
There's no band that has ever been able to harness the sound of what SSD is. It's a complete planet to themselves. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, they're obviously influenced by Black Flag. They're obviously influenced by Minor Threat. Even on Glue, the boom doom doom, like it's almost like a serene like rowboat on a river, but then holy shit, there's a giant waterfall coming, and then it flies down that when the song kicks in. So I feel like that part is kind of influenced by Greg Ginn a bit, but then when they go fast and they go hard, it's their own sound completely. There's nothing like it. It's so different. It's vibe more than anything. It's just anger personified, but with an attempt to express that same anger through music and not just screaming. Do you know what I mean?
They had to be a band that wrote the songs like in a room. Like it had to be a dude with a drummer. These are not bedroom riffs. This is not like one guitarist like writing shit in the room. Like it's like jamming. It has to be.
It's definitely jamming, but he's definitely the general.
No, for sure. But it's like writing with the drummer for sure. It's not like a dude writing in his head. He has to feel the power, you know. Ben, let's go on to DYS and Last Rites and Negative Effects. Let's put these guys together.
All right, these are kind of the other straight edge-ish bands. I guess none of these bands were like 100% straight edge members, but that was like normal for the early 80s. But they were claiming it, whatever. They had X's on their hands and they fucking sang about how you shouldn't do drugs. Close enough. DYS is like, I always think of them as like the little brother band of SSD. Like their record, they like put out a record the year after SSD does. They go hard rock like the year after SSD does. Maybe at the same time, but the records come out a little bit later. And like, it's a little bit more straight down the middle traditional hardcore for this first album for Brotherhood. You know, More Than Fashion is there is the SSD flavor in it, but it's a little less out there.
In the first riff, but then they dial it in, right?
Yeah, it's easier. I think this would be an easier record to grasp for someone who's not acclimated to SSD yet. And then Last Rites, this song Chunks, speaking of Discharge, reminds me of one of the few slow Discharge songs, State Violence, State Control, a real kind of mid-tempo chugging song. And I love it. It's one of the best songs of this whole, region / era. And they only
History
ever...
of Earth. It's one of the best songs in the history of Earth, Ben.
Yeah.
And the Dinosaur Jr. cover is awesome.
And you just read the next note on my fucking notes. But yes.
All right, I'm going to shut up. Damn it.
But this is interesting because the only show Last Rites ever played was in Western Massachusetts. And I assume in the audience were members of Deep Wound who then formed Dinosaur Jr. Because that's where they were from. And then Negative Effects is pre-Last Rites. This is all Choke. Choke was in Negative Effects, then Last Rites, then Slapshot. And so Negative Effects is more kind of raw, brutal, straightforward, hardcore, kind of simple beats. It's good. I never thought it was as good as Last Rites, but Restraining Order, I think, is the current band that's keeping that Negative Effects Last Rites sound alive in 2021. And they're from Western Mass in Connecticut too. They're from that same region that, Dinosaur Jr. and Deep Wound are from. So that's kind of probably coincidental.
Yeah, like the Last Rites songs that come out are absolute bangers, but Negative Effects does have more output. Dan, what's your take on this stuff?
I mean, Choke can do no wrong. He can.
No, you can't. You keep your mouth shut about the Veterans Day episode, dude. It's gonna be epic.
But I mean, there's an argument to be said that Chunks is the best song out of Boston ever. That could be a good argument. I mean, we've had that argument. We did a Boston Super 7. Go back and listen. And I didn't pick Chunks, but I do back it.
And you chose side B on the Chunks 7-inch on a side A, side B episode.
That's true, because that day I was just... It's just so oi, and I was just feeling my oats on the oi world, that day. And also, it's just nice to counterpoint, and... to give some shine to something else from time to time. But if we were picking today, Chunks wins. What I will say is that, I do think Last Rites, just the I suppose the more punkness of it compared to Negative Effects, or the more like just rawness, I like better. But I mean, this whole playlist is just chock-a-block. Great hardcore.
Yeah, let's go on and put the next three together as well. So FU's 2 songs, the Jerry's Kids, and the Freeze. Ben, kick it off.
FU's, they put out Kill for Christ in 82, My America 83, and then they take a little bit of a right turn in 84 with Do We Really Want to Hurt You? Now, the thing is, a lot of these first-generation hardcore bands, if they stuck around into the mid-80s, they started going hard rock, and almost without exception became really bad hard rock bands. And I say almost without exception because the FUs actually became a better band when they started putting hard rock in their sound. I think Do We Really Want to Hurt You? Not on the playlist. I understand though, because we're talking about the very early days. But there's a song on that called Young Fast Iranians, which I think is a friggin' masterpiece. And as a straight up hardcore band like Kill for Christ, My America era, never really did much for me. Good, not something I revisit very much. Jerry's Kids. The thing about Jerry's Kids is the beats on this record sound like if you took an entire drum kit and just threw them down a flight of stairs. But if the drums hit rhythmically in time to the music, because this drummer's doing more rolls than an actual regular beat. Like if you actually counted the amount of time he's doing rolls, it's going to be greater than just the straight beat, which is like, holy shit, this guy loves doing rolls. And it's like almost distracting, but there's a great song on this album called Crucify Me, which I want to say I played it for Graham Kleiss just before we started Fields of Fire. And he goes, Jerry's Kids is my favorite band in the world. And for like 3 weeks, Jerry's Kids was his favorite band ever. And then he discovered Blast and it was all over. The Freeze, I'm glad Pops mentioned that the bane of Zach's existence, that dreaded number 1.5, because when we went back and reassessed all this music for that article me and Daniel Weitzman wrote, it hit me like, oh my God, Freeze is totally that. They're absolutely that middle ground between punk and hardcore. Land of the Lost, Rabid Reaction, those first 2 albums. It's funny, every time I hear that Land of the Lost album, I think, this is so good. Why don't I listen to this more often? And then I never do listen to it more often. But they are great. And there is something musical about them that kind of gets lost in the sauce when the bands get really, really fast, circa 82 FU's Jerry's Kids kind of vibe. So that's what I got for this set of bands.
Yeah, the Freeze stuff is like it's like early OC-esque almost. Like it's like Angry Samoan style.
Yep.
Being like tongue in cheek, like right there musically and like lyrically. So it is cool. This Jerry's Kids song though, is such a rager, dude. Because like it's not even a riff. Like, and I love the way they end it. It's like so triumphant. And then like that fast, hard fade on it. It's like, dude, I'm listening to this thing 3 times in a row. Fuck it. But it's not a riff. Like, they're not writing a riff. It's literally like 3 notes in like a standard like scale. Da, da, da. Like just nice sounding basic ass notes. But it's so early and there's so much like fury behind it that it's just like, oh my God, this is perfect hardcore that like can't be replicated. And the FU stuff, I strongly disagree with Ben. I had like some like bootleg LP that was like the Do You Really Want Us to Hurt You on one side and one of the first ones on the other side. And it was just like, yeah, I can't get down with the third LP that much. But I will check out. Ben, I know you'll text me after this and remind me of that song so I can check it out. Dan, what's your take on this stuff?
Well, the drummer of Jerry's Kids is a huge Safaris fan.
It's, what's funny is like that ties into the Graham Kleiss story, right? Because I've enjoyed surf music for like a long time, and I always wondered like what the fuck happened to it, because it was so huge for a long time and then it just went away. And I found out that surf was like the biggest music in the country before the Beatles hit.
Yep.
So like literally it was like huge, and then people are like, oh shit, choruses are the shit. And it's kind of the same, right? Like Jerry's Kids is like Graham's favorite band for the 3 weeks before he discovers Blast, and then there's no going back. It's like there's no post Blast Graham, and there's no post like surf after the Beatles.
Yeah, well put.
That's all I got, Dan. Move on.
Yeah.
Dan, have you ever seen that movie Kung Fu Hustle?
Yeah, Shaolin Soccer. I think oh god, now we've got off on such a tangent where we're talking about the Beatles.
FU's Jerry's Kids Freeze.
Yes, okay. So the Freeze were one of the bands that, like, when I was really first getting into punk, like I had a Freeze cassette, and there was one song that had the catchiest chorus, and now I can't remember what the name of the song is, and I should definitely go down a Freeze wormhole, but it was a song that I rewound so much that I like listened to that same chorus because it had the most aggressive but melodic sound in it. And I think that's what the Freeze encapsulates really well, is that they're giving you melody, but it's coming at you like a train, not necessarily as fast as Safari's Jerry Kids dude is giving it to you, but it's aggressive. It's melody that could be on the radio, but played with such aggression. That's kind of what some of the Freeze songs are like. And the FUs, I've never really dived in that much. and this that's the great thing about a starter kit. This is giving me something to sink my teeth into.
Yeah. Pops, can you pronounce the next band so I don't sound like I was born with no thumbs?
The Proletariat.
That's
There.
it.
The Proletariat. Ben and Dan, were you aware of this band and were you a fan of them before this playlist?
Yes, a Proletariat. I've had that discography CD for 20 years, and I rarely revisit it. And the song Pops picked for the playlist is so friggin' good. I am going to revisit it. And the Proletariat stand out to me as being very UK influenced, almost to the point where he's kind of doing an English accent. And lyrically very crass, musically very Gang of Four. And then Siege is a band I could never get into. They were kind of sold to me as proto power violence, and since that's not my scene, I'm very curious for people who do know a lot about that scene. What did the early 90s power violence bands add to the formula that Siege created that made them different? Like, why isn't Siege just a power violence band? Retroactively labeled power violence band. What was it? Maybe those early 90s bands added those really, really slow mosh parts in between the super fast parts. Maybe that's it.
That's what I was going to say, because they were coming. A lot of those early power violence bands were still just thinking of themselves as hardcore bands, influenced by stuff that was a little more obscure, but they're still kind of like operating in that structure, whereas Siege doesn't have that structure. They're all over the place, and I think that's what it was. If we were to boil it down, it's just that they were putting these wild elements in a format that was a little more palatable.
It's not the super speed scissor beat or like the super slow mosh parts, and they're not mushed together as much. Like, it really is like the proto of that stuff. And it's still like catchy, straightforward hardcore. I love this stuff. I haven't listened to it a long time. It's like an LP that I used to listen to. And this song coming on the playlist was like a total palate cleanser after like the previous one.
Well, what's interesting about Siege and interesting about a point Pops made is the Velvet Underground. What's interesting about that is, people say, not many people saw the Velvet Underground, but they went on to influence the world. Siege is kind of like that. Like, Japanese hardcore references Siege. I mean, a lot of Japanese hardcore, not holistically, but a lot of the gnarly Japanese hardcore that came out in the 80s, Siege is a big influence. Like you say, the power violence stuff, Infest, etc. Siege is a big influence. It's like it's a band that almost its influences, it's being name checked as an influence is what has made the band live on, even more than probably listenership.
Yeah, it rules. It rules. All right, final takes. Pops, you feel good about our takes on this stuff?
These are great takes. The only thing I'd add is that you can pick it up. It's a discount buy, but Siege reunited in the early 90s, played a couple shows with Seth Putnam, RIP, on vocals, and they did a 7-inch with him. And that thing is a fucking it was a surprising ripper and has no bearing on this list, but I just want to throw it in there as a little hidden gem to peep. You probably get it for $6.
We should have done a collector's bargain corner. God damn it. We haven't done that in a while. That would have been perfect. All right, Ben, final thoughts?
Siege has a CD, but it only ever came out in Mexico.
I'll look for it for you next time I'm down there this weekend.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah. I think I'm just going camping. But Dan, final thoughts?
Boston hardcore is very much of what it is. It's very hard-nosed, working class, hard, but it's also got nods to intellectualism and art and looking for the light in the dark, really. There's a lot of pulling out fun melody out of the hardest riffs ever. So Boston has continued to do that, like, over time and time again. And Boston is very similar to what we've name checked in the past of like Oxnard and Chula Vista and things like that, where they've been very bands that are coming in the future are looking back to the historical roots of their city for influence and not just looking elsewhere. And I think this is a great starting point to listen to Boston music. And Boston music rules. Most Bostonians don't. And Boston sports teams can suck a dick.
Not tonight. Oh, wait, I dated the pod. Fuck.
And Aerosmith really sucks. Almost as bad as the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So
They're worse.
But the band Boston rules. And I'm not being ironic, sarcastic.
Hey, Ben, you got more than a feeling. Ben, you got more than a feeling. Ben, you got